Welcome back to America's Voice Live. Well, yesterday, President Joe Biden spoke to the country on protecting the sacred constitutional right to vote, as he put it, where he compared the Texas voting bill to Jim Crow in the 21st century. Not over the top rhetoric at all, of course. Joining me now to discuss this, President of the Crime Prevention Research Center, Dr. John Lott. Doctor, all of this rhetoric, this is the biggest threat to voting rights since the Civil War and all of these other things. I might remind the Democrats it was they who fought a civil war to keep people enslaved. It was they that battled against the 15th Amendment that gave freed slaves the right to vote. Woodrow Wilson also fought against the right of women to vote until he finally couldn't take it anymore, and his wife Edith pushed it over the finish line in 1918, and the list goes on and on and on. But this idea that somehow having voter ID and having standardized hours of voting and early voting is akin to racism or white supremacy it's absolutely absurd, is it not?
Well, look, if it's anti-democratic, what the Republicans are talking about in Texas or Georgia, then Democrats must think the whole rest of the world is anti-democratic. The voter ID rules that they're talking about in Texas are less stringent than the voter ID rules that they have in 46 of the 47 countries in Europe, and pretty soon all 47 countries in Europe. The vast majority of Europe bans absentee ballots because of concerns about vote buying and vote fraud. They don't have things like these early voting that we have here in the United States. The big thing that Democrats got particularly upset about with regard to the Texas legislation is that they wanted to make sure that there was a chain of custody for ballot boxes. In Harris County, Texas, during this last election, they would leave ballot boxes out unattended for 24 hours a day. The legislation restricts it to like 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., but allows it to be monitored by people at all the times where it's out in the public. I can't find another country in the world that leaves ballot boxes unattended, let alone unattended at 3 a.m. in the morning when absolutely nobody is going to be watching them to make sure that nothing nefarious.
What could possibly go wrong with that, Doctor? I mean, just a ballot box sitting there with no camera, no security. What could possibly go wrong? I want to ask you about mail-in ballots in Europe and other places around the world. You say no absentee ballots. Does that include mail-in ballots? Because we had massive mail-in ballots in the United States in 2020. Joe Biden secured the win with 40,000 votes spread over 3 states that all had massive mail-in ballots. How are those viewed in the rest of the world?
Oh, well, I mean, they don't even have anything even close to mail-in ballots. Absentee ballots are more restrictive than the general mail-in ballots that we saw this last election in many places. Because with absentee ballots, you have to go and request a ballot be sent to you. With mail-in ballots, they just send it to you if your name's on the voter registration rolls. To just give you an idea for Europe, 74% of the countries in Europe completely ban absentee ballots for people who are living in the country. Another 21% require that you have to have a photo ID and to go and physically pick up the ballot. They will not put it in the mail to you. And some of those countries even limit it even further of that 21% to people who are either in the military or in the hospital. And they just don't take your word for it. Here in the United States, if you apply for an absentee ballot, you just tell them, I'm going to be out of town, whether that's true or not, and they'll send you an absentee ballot. But in these countries in Europe, you have to have third-party verification. They don't take your word. You have to have the hospital or the military verify that you will not be available to vote on that day.
So how do we arrive in a place where the narrative is being foisted upon the American public that somehow it's racist, it's white supremacy, it's all of these terrible things, it's trying to keep black and brown people from voting and all of this other stuff. If you live in a rural area, you're not capable of getting an ID photocopied. I mean, they've never heard of picture phones apparently in rural America. They're incapable of functioning. And so the only way that it can be done is that we get no IDs, all the mail-in ballots you want, no checking, no chain of custody. Apparently that's the way you have a fair election in the mind of the Democrats, unless I'm misunderstanding.
Well, apparently Kamala Harris doesn't believe that people in rural areas are able to buy guns because they have to have an ID, obviously, a government-issued photo ID to be able to go and buy guns. But this notion that it's discriminatory against Black or Hispanic individuals, just look at the rest of the world. Countries that have huge Hispanic populations, Mexico, for example, has much more restrictive voting regulations than any state in the United States is even remotely talking about. The election occurs on one day. Texas allows early voting for something like 12 days before the election. They required a government-issued photo ID that has your thumbprint on it in addition to your picture. So they check your thumbprint when you vote, and that also gives ink on your finger, which makes it harder for people to vote multiple times. In 1991, they banned all absentee ballots for people living in the country or living outside the country. And the thing is, when you look at Mexico, you would think, geez, all these restrictions on voting, they won't even send your ID to you in the mail. You have to go twice, once to apply for it, a second time to pick it up. Many Mexican states only had one office, so you may have to travel 75 miles or even 100 miles to go and obtain your voter ID. You would think voter participation rates should have fallen off the cliff after the 1991 reform. But what you find is that the voter participation rates in the 3 presidential elections after the 1991 reform compared to the 3 presidential elections beforehand went from 59% turnout to 68% turnout. So it was a dramatic increase in turnout, and there's a simple reason for that. People became more convinced that their votes counted. When there was all sorts of that was occurring, people said, what's the point of voting? The government party is going to keep on winning over and over again, so why even bother to go and vote? If you want to talk about voter suppression, the fact that you have it so that Democrats are fighting tooth and nail against an audit in Pennsylvania, or Biden travels to Pennsylvania yesterday to go and use terms about...
Sure. And you have to wonder why. Why are they so opposed to looking deeper and looking farther? We've got to leave it there for today, Doctor, but you have to wonder what's wrong with having a review of the elections in a proper way. If, as people are famous for saying, if you've got nothing to hide, what are you worried about? We'll leave it there for today.
Sure.
But Dr. John Lott, greatly appreciate it. As always, my friend, thank you so much. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back on America's Voice Live.